Welcome to the Road Home podcast with Ethan Nichtern. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
Hi, everybody. This is Ethan Nichtern. This is the Road Home podcast, and I'm happy to be joined by Professor Ann Gleig, who's an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Central Florida, and also the author of the book American Dharma, Buddhism Beyond Modernity. So Ann, welcome to the Road Home podcast.
Oh, hi, Ethan. Thank you for the invitation.
There's lots of reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast, and your knowledge and coverage of kind of contemporary movements in Buddhism, and I love following you on Twitter. But I always ask how people got interested in Buddhism to begin with, or got interested in meditation, or so I'm really interested in how your path started and how you came to be an academic.
That's a great question. So I guess my first encounter with Buddhism came as a teenager, and I'd grown up Catholic. I'm from a Catholic, kind of Irish Catholic family in Liverpool. And I guess when, as I came to kind of age as a teenager, I, kind of realized that I was gay. And so that I, that I knew that I wouldn't have a place, it didn't feel possible for me to stay in Catholicism at that time. But I'd been a very kind of religious kid, I was very kind of oriented towards, existential questions and kind of religious questions. So really just as a young teen, I think, probably 30 and 40, and I just started to, kind of explore other religions. And I first kind of encountered Buddhism, honestly, really through literature. I think, through I'm kind of a little embarrassed, because as a scholar, we're quite critical of, the kind of beat literature. But as a teenager, I really kind of gobbled up like the Dharma bums and Allen Ginsberg. And, so I really came to kind of Buddhism, through a very kind of romanticized kind of literary form. And then also, as I, got a bit older, I came to university age. So I had to apply, I was getting ready to apply for university when I was 18. And I'd kind of dug into a lot of, kind of literature like Alan Watts and Krishnamurti and, Autobiography of a Yogi, some of these, I think, books that are probably, kind of also, have been popular with some of your audience. And I just really, I really wanted to kind of get a deeper knowledge of, the kind of historic traditions out of which this kind of literature developed. So I went off to, Bristol University, with the intention to study Hinduism and Buddhism. And then, kind of ended up focusing, a little bit more on Buddhism because there were two, excellent professors of Buddhism there. So that's kind of, it was, really my encounter with Buddhism has always been, both a kind of personal, existential one and also an academic one.
So, So how did you, I want to ask how you got into writing American Dharma, but I also maybe part of at least your expertise, in your book and on social media, which is two big realms of, expressing your expertise, is sort of, to study a lot of the different movements in contemporary Buddhism, especially contemporary Western Buddhism. So was there something specific that made you want to take sort of that global contemporary approach to sort of analyzing movements in contemporary Buddhism?
Yeah, no, it was, it was a long journey. Let's see how I can summarize it. So originally, I'd gone the kind of classical Buddhist route. I did my undergraduate degree, in Buddhism, and then I went off to do an MA. I was planning to do it. I started the MA in Buddhist studies, planning to actually focus on Chinese Buddhism. And this was a while ago because I took a big gap out, but it's probably, I think it was 1995 or 1996. And essentially, at that time, there was a lot of kind of really exciting work coming out of like feminism. And I was kind of identified as a queer, and I was really into kind of intersectional feminism and kind of post-colonial feminism. And I was really struggling to connect, my kind of classical studies of Buddhism with, really with like intersectional feminism and like what it meant to be, a young queer, in a kind of unjust world. And so I basically had a little crisis of like my academic trajectory, and I ended up taking quite a lot of time out. I took, I think, 7 or 8 years out. And then I went back to do my PhD and then moved to America. And I think, essentially around that time, I'd ended up kind of thinking about like, maybe studying, contemporary forms of Buddhism, would be a way for me to bring together some of the different parts of like my kind of self, and my different interests. So I ended up going more the kind of American Buddhist route. And there's other parts to the story. I had some issues with funding for language school, which, made it hard for me to go the classical route as well. I just kind of, through a couple of things like that, I ended up landing on, the contemporary Buddhist landscape. And as you keep on referring to Twitter, I think that, that's another thing that I've a lot of my research has also ended up being tracking, contemporary Buddhism online. So I do spend a lot of time on social media, and it's a mix of kind of work and kind of indulgence as well.
I also spend too much time on Twitter these days, but maybe now with the inauguration, I can spend a little bit less. We'll see how it goes. So talk to me about, writing this book, American Dharma, where you look at a lot of these movements in contemporary Buddhism. And then I want to ask a question because it kind of, it piques my interest because it's something I studied in university, postmodernism and themes like structuralism and post-structuralism. So how you bring modernism and postmodernism into sort of contemporary movements in Buddhism was really interesting to me. So how did this book come about, American Dharma?
Yeah, so essentially, it was quite interesting because I ended up settling on a dissertation topic I was looking at, it was a comparative project on American Buddhism and American Hinduism. And I was really interested in, kind of identifying the kind of specific kind of modernization kind of processes that were happening, in those kind of spaces. But as I was doing my ethnographic work, I kind of started to notice that as well as the kind of modernization processes that were happening, that there was also, as well as the kind of continuation of the modernization processes, that there was also kind of some resistance and some kind of reflection on the limits of kind of the modernization of Hinduism and Buddhism. So that was a kind of like theme that I couldn't really dig deep at when I was doing my dissertation because, it would have been too much to manage. But after my dissertation, when I was, doing postdoc work, I decided, that would be a really good kind of thread to pick up. So I did 2 ethnographic case studies. One was on the East Bay Meditation Center which is in Oakland, California, and has been like really a hub for racial justice in American Dharma Buddhism. You likely are familiar with it. And then the other community is really different. It was a Buddhist geeks community, which, was really about bringing Buddhism into dialogue with millennial culture and technology. But in these, so in these two different projects, I really saw, again, this really clear theme of both the continuation and also a kind of correction or an attempted correction of modernity. And so in thinking about, well, how can I theorize that? It doesn't fit into like the modern framework. So that kind of moved me into, thinking about, well, how does, postmodernism or post-colonialism or the post-secular, as frameworks, do they account for this phenomena better? So then, I just decided to do a new book project. So I think a lot of people, when they finish their dissertation, you just really feel like you want to break from it. So I had a lot of juice in this new project anyway. And so that project, that new project ended up, a few years later, being the American Dharma book. So yeah, that's kind of how I landed there.
So this might be hard to say, succinctly, but just for folks who, for example, did not take a modern culture and media course at Brown University, which is where can you kind of succinctly define in general modernism or modernity and postmodernism, for people who haven't read, one of the late 20th century French cultural critics, like Derrida or Jean Baudrillard or somebody like that, all these people that I only knew their names because I was trying to get some girl's attention, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read that much Derrida myself, so just as a heads up to the viewers, the listeners that, they're not alone. So modernity essentially refers both to an historical time period, which is generally dated from the late 15th century to the, I guess, normally like the mid 20th century. So it's an historic period which saw like hugely significant kind of cultural and political shifts that really changed the landscape of, Western culture. I'm just focusing on modernity here as a Western phenomena. And then as well as an historic period, it also refers to a kind of set of kind of philosophical and social and cultural and even kind of religious, kind of ideas and ideals. So some of the kind of, shifts that happen in modernity are, often it's, dated to the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation really kind of shattered, the kind of medieval Christian world, both the cosmology and also the kind of institutional world. It really, brought a kind of focus on the individual and, was kind of really key to the kind of print and press and the kind of democratization of religious literature. Modernity is also characterized by the development of science, biomedicine and technology. Modernity also witnesses the growth of industrialization and capitalism. It is, in terms of ideals, modernity puts a kind of emphasis on human reason, on the empirical method, on the individual, on democracy and the nation state. It's really enamored, by the idea of progress and evolution. And modernity often defined itself in opposition to the traditional world. So, often modernity would, like modern, philosophers and kind of advocates would talk about, the traditional world is like the world of superstition and irrationality, and the modern world is, the age of reason and human maturity and human progress. And then, the other big thing that happens in, modernity that's really, relevant to my work is, the kind of the colonial project, colonialism. And so the colonial period overlaps with modernity. It refers to an historic period between 15th and 20th centuries when, the newly emerged European nation states basically, go on these huge conquests and establish kind of colonies across the world. Colonialism, of course, is a project of domination, political, economic, religious, and cultural domination. And the European colonizers, they were really, they were convinced of their own kind of right to, colonize, other parts of the world. And they basically justified, their superiority, through modernity, through, essentially saying, we've developed these modern, systems of science and these modern values of individualism and democracy, and we're going to bring that to these, quotation marks, primitive kind of nations. And then in the religious sphere, colonialism was, closely linked to Christian missionary work. And you had, this kind of idea that Christianity was the most evolved religion. It was basically a kind of almost scientific, evolutionary reading of religion, which kind of put Christianity at the pinnacle, and all the, again, highly quotation marks, primitive or heathen religions or pagan religions, below it, including Buddhism. And so this idea that, the modern colonizers, are going to go to, all across the world and bring civilization and Christianity. So yeah, that's just a very, short summary of modernity and colonialism. Do you need more, or do you think that?
No, I mean, maybe just talk a little bit about postmodernity then. What is the general shift into postmodernity?
Well, I do want to do that, but I think it might also be, before I go into the postmodern, it might be useful just to talk a little bit of what was the impact of modernity on Buddhism?
Beautiful, thank you.
Okay, yeah. Is it right? So basically, when the term modern Buddhism, or we now use more commonly Buddhist modernism, is basically an academic framework that was developed to understand these new and distinct forms of Buddhism that emerge from the encounter between traditional Asian Buddhism and Western modernity under these conditions of colonialism. So essentially you had, several kind of scholars of, Buddhist studies, George Bond, Donald Swearer, Donald Lopez, David McMahon, basically, charted these shifts that were happening in, Asian Buddhist countries as a result of the interaction between the Buddhists and the modernizers. And essentially, I think, they came, they looked at different contexts. So, some scholars looked at Buddhism in Southeast Asia, in, Sri Lanka and Thailand, in Burma, Myanmar now. And others looked, at countries that weren't under, like Japan wasn't directly colonized, but still, Japanese Buddhists were in dialogue with, modernity as a kind of cultural and philosophical kind of revolution. And so essentially you get these new kind of reformed, forms of Buddhism appearing. And some of the kind of common characteristics of Buddhist modernism are, so number one is a claim to return to the kind of original or pure or authentic teachings of the Buddha. So this was like the basic, argument was, Buddhism, the Buddha started, taught this, like new radical, religion. And, it's kind of gotten a lot, and, the Asians have done a terrible job at looking after it. And they've just kind of, they've just kind of layered it with all of these kind of, cultural and kind of superstitions and kind of metaphysical beliefs. But, as a modern reader or as a modern, monastic or as, a modern, scholar, we can get back to this original Buddhism. Now, that's a very probably likely your audience, are not familiar with Protestant, kind of thinking, but that actually mirrors, what the Protestants kind of said about Christianity. The Protestants were like, the Catholic Church has kind of, lost the plot, it's lost the essential teachings of the New Testament, and it's got all of these metaphysical layers, all of these saints, all of these corrupt authorities, but we're going to get back to the New Testament. So essentially what happens is that you just see that there's it's like a Protestant Buddhism. There's this kind of approach to Buddhism that's really shaped by that kind of modern Protestant kind of orientation. A second characteristic that happens is that Buddhism becomes framed as a kind of inherently rational, scientific and empirical religion. And this is probably, the form of Buddhism that, most kind of Americans are familiar with, that they kind of really like. When I have undergraduate students, they come into the class, nearly always with this kind of belief that, Buddhism is really scientific. But the reason that they have that belief is, as a consequence of, the shaping of Buddhism under the pressures of modernity. So because the modern world and the modernizers, really, they really regarded science so highly, then the Buddhists had to kind of respond. They had to kind of prove themselves against that Western ideal of science. So they actually do something that's really sneaky. So they say, look, you colonizers, like you're coming here and saying, the West is the best because we've got science and Christianity. But they say, actually, Buddhism is more scientific than Christianity. So they kind of accept, these kind of modern categories and modern values, and then they kind of subvert them to work for Buddhism, to kind of say, hey, actually, Buddhism is the most scientific religion. So, they're just, a couple of characteristics that hopefully will give, your audience a sense of how Buddhism, is selectively presented to kind of appeal to these kind of modern values, if that makes sense. Oh, and then the other thing that I will say that I think is really important is that a really big thing that happens in the modernization of Buddhism under colonialism is that meditation, the practice of meditation, becomes both revitalized, revived, and also kind of democratized. So, for the first, again, this is also, something my students are always so surprised, to hear that historically, only a small percentage of traditional Buddhists meditated. Meditation was, it was just for kind of an elite, group of monks. But of course, under, the modern kind of modernization process, meditation becomes something for the first time that's really offered en masse to the householders. And then, that's kind of the insight, that's where like the insight lineage comes from. So that's basically, how modern Buddhism is formed, in this encounter between, modernity and Asian Buddhism, and also, under the unequal, in an unequal context of colonialism. So it's a dialogue. It is a dialogue. There are many Asian monastics who are absolutely key to the formation of Buddhist modernism. Like, it's not just a Western phenomena. Like, Asian monastics themselves had, a lot of agency and like innovation. But the dialogue is happening in this fundamentally unequal way, of colonialism. So then in terms of like postmodernism, so, essentially, like, as I was saying, when I was doing my ethnography at the East Bay Meditation Society and the Buddhist Geek Society, I was noticing that some of the things that I was seeing, in these communities, we're really compatible with these, it's like, oh yeah, that's definitely a modernist characteristic. Like, there's an emphasis on meditation. But I also noticed at the same time that there was also pushback, towards some characteristics of Buddhist modernism. And so that's when I started to think about, postmodernism as another framework to understand what was happening on the ground in American Buddhist communities. So what is postmodernism? I think you're going to ask me. So postmodernism is, it's a very contested and complex term.
Right.
So often people think, immediately they go to someone like Derrida, like a postmodern or post-structuralist philosopher. I actually don't use it in that way. I use postmodernism in my book in a sociological way. Mm-hmm. And sociologically, postmodernity is understood as both an extension or a continuation of modern values, but also as a critique and interrogation of modern values. And postmodernity, as in that sense, is often dated to the mid-20th century, basically after the world wars and, the nuclear bomb going off in Japan, being set off in Japan. And just like, essentially, a lot of the modern beliefs, were, wow, the modern world is just going to go from strength to strength. We're on this ladder of evolution and progress. We're going to develop these great humanistic ethics. But that didn't happen. The 20th century witnessed, this intense violence. And so it really led to a period of philosophers and cultural theorists reflecting on, what's gone wrong with modernity. So in that sense, it is the interrogation of modernity. And then, of course, the other thing that's happening is there is an increased globalization starts, with in the colonial world, but it starts to, increase through the rapid development of, the new communication and information technologies. And then there's also, we also distinguish like a late capitalism period. And then you've got this rise of consumer culture. So essentially, to summarize postmodernity, we can say it involves a questioning and superstition of some modern ideals, or meta-narratives are called, such as science, reason, and universalism. It tends to celebrate cultural particularity, diversity, difference, and hybridity. Culturally, aesthetically, it's kind of marked by a kind of bricolage, and a kind of blending of different high and low cultures. And closely related to postmodernism is post-colonialism. And essentially, post-colonialism refers, like modernism, refers both to an historic period in which the colonized nations establish independence, and also to a kind of set of ideas and theories that critique the legacies of colonialism. And so some of the, main points of post-colonialism, it kind of overlaps with post-colonialism, are, this kind of interrogation of universalism and individualism and liberalism, and a kind of recovery of some of the, voices, the marginalized voices, indigenous people who had been kind of erased and silenced in modernity. So essentially, postmodernity is this kind of conversation. Postmodernity is like what comes after modernity historically. And it's also a kind of conversation and a critique and a continuation of the ideals of modernity. Right. Sorry, this is so much information.
No, it's great. It's great. So just to jump in, like when you're talking about the modernity's, intersection with Buddhism, or Buddhism's rise within that space, or within those values and those worldviews, some of it felt, very colonial and co-optive, like the idea that the modern Western, usually white Buddhist thinks, we are doing this better. We have a more scientific or psychological approach where we're returning to what the Buddha actually meant here, and
yeah, that's a really good expression.
And so some of it feels, really, aggressive, violent, or, just co-optive. Some of it, struck me as like, oh, that's great. Like a democratization of who gets to meditate, that it's not just a small monastic community. So how does, what do you see as some of the postmodern movements in Buddhism that are happening now? And is it equally kind of, some of it feels good, some of it feels bad, or does it actually feel like a positive evolution for you?
No, I think I'm really glad that you kind of emphasize the kind of, the mix of the modern, that I think, there's a lot, there's definitely a lot to critique about modernity. But I think, there's a lot of, valuable things from modernity. And in one way, I think, like in some ways you could think of like post-modernity and post-colonialism. Again, they're like huge terms. So there's different, expressions of them. But, in one sense, you can think that, they're really, they're kind of asking, they're pointing out the ways in which the modern world doesn't live up to its own ideals, So, the modern world, it prides itself on like democracy. But we know at the beginning of, modernity, it was only like white men who could vote, so it was like a partial view of modernity, there was an ideal of democracy, but in practice, it wasn't, enacting itself on the ground. And I think that you can think of, some of the things happening in, the postmodern or the post-colonial as, really, pushing modernity to really be democratic. Like, what does democracy, really look like? So I think that is something really good that's happening, in terms of, it's not a complete rejection of Buddhist modernism, but it is really interrogating, the kind of limits of Buddhist modernism. I think, something really good, I think that's happening is, the racial justice work. You yourself just mentioned, this kind of Western, white ethnocentric view of, we're doing Buddhism better. But when we look at the white convert Sanghas, we see that, okay, there is democratization that's happened, in terms of, say, householders or teachers, and it's not just a monastic authority. And also say, okay, well, there's a lot of like female teachers. But then on the other hand, you can see, well, the female teachers are all white, and, the Sangha's pretty white as well, so it hasn't got this like racial diversity. There's not much class kind of diversity. So, in that sense, I think some of the, postmodern, post-colonial manifestations of Buddhism, are really, really enacting, embodying, some of these kind of real ideals where it's a Sangha for everyone, So I think the racial justice work for me is like the best of Buddhist, Buddhism Beyond Modernity,
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, I want to get your take too on this, because I want to shift. You've done a lot of work also to look into what some of the weirder, strands or kind of subdivisions of Buddhist groups and other kind of yoga groups, etc. But I kind of the conversation I always come back to, and I'm wondering now if this is just my sort of like modernity or strong post-modernity, I'm not sure, but like I've always felt that Buddhism was meant to be a political practice as well, and that the teachings really work with that sort of, political framework. They are very personal in some ways, but also that, they're about interdependence and sangha and, values of compassion, etc. And I always had a hard time viewing, like, how does that not automatically go towards the political? So I wonder, like, would this be just us taking the modernist approach of saying, like, when you say the racial justice piece is some of the best of Buddhist postmodernity, like, because I agree with what you're saying, and is what we're saying there that, like, that it's just the best, that it's the part that we like the most, or are we saying that it somehow aligns with the meaning of these teachings and practices and philosophies and traditions? Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I do hear what you're saying. It's a great question. I think there's a lot in what you say. So I think the first thing is that, there is a very kind of popular idea in the West, especially amongst white Buddhists, that Buddhism is apolitical, that it's not political, and that they generally see, they make that claim. They say Buddhism's, apolitical or transcends politics. And they claim that, racial justice work is a kind of intrusion of progressive politics, and literally, like, because you probably seen me like fighting on Twitter about this, they'll say things like it's an invasion of, or an infection, like they use quite intense language of, progressive politics or identity politics into, this apparently apolitical tradition. Like, no scholar of Buddhism would ever argue that Buddhism is apolitical. Like, Buddhism as an historic tradition has always been political. So you'd ask me, when we talked before, is Buddhism inherently political? And I wouldn't use the language of inherent, but I'd use the language of historic. Like, if we look at Buddhism historically, we can see that politics manifests on a number of levels. So, there's in the texts across, the Pali Canon and the Mahayana Sutras and the Tantras, the literature of Vajrayana Buddhism, we find political exchanges. We find, the Buddha giving advice to kings and to, kind of state figures. There's a lot of political metaphors in the tradition itself. And then historically, Buddhism has been so closely interlinked with with different kind of nationalist kind of projects. So Buddhism is always political. But when Buddhist modernism is constructed, it's constructed both by scholars and also kind of Buddhist modernist teachers like, say, D.T. Suzuki. It is kind of presented as, this kind of apolitical, kind of transcendent kind of mind state, And so I think that that's where a lot of the confusion around these issues comes, that it's like, that's why a lot of people are, confused that Buddhism is, they think Buddhism is apolitical. So we can say for sure Buddhism is political. Now, the next part of the question I would say is, okay, but in what way has it been political? So has it been historically politically conservative, or is it historically being politically progressive, right? And so I would say that, like, looking at the history of Buddhism and the Buddhist canon, I'd say the dominant form of politics in Buddhism has lent more to what we would probably think of as more conservative. So in early Buddhism, for example, you have, this kind of notion of the kind of enlightened monarch, and, this kind of Dharma king, and, the sense that the Dharma king is going to be like, just as the Buddha is like the kind of, transcendent king of the realm, the Dharma king is like the representative. Not unlike the way, you find in also in Christianity, where there's a kind of, divine hierarchy that's kind of also kind of mirrored in a social hierarchy. So that is certainly present in Buddhism, in the canon, and historically, this interlinking of Buddhism with, state power and imperial power. However, there's also, a narrative, a kind of lineage in Buddhism of, Buddhists who were more kind of oriented to, more like radical social action. So that you could, make the argument, and some scholars do, that they're kind of earlier precursors to, the kind of engaged Buddhism that we see, with the racial justice work. So I think I've been, thinking a lot about this because, originally I used to agree with the theory that, because there's a couple of different kind of theories in Buddhist scholarship. And originally I used to agree that progressive Buddhism, only really begins, as part of Buddhist modernism, because social reform is, another mark of Buddhist modernism. But actually recent scholarship, because, the other thing is that there's so much of, Buddhism that we don't know about. The study of Buddhism is, quite young. And there's some really, really, really exciting scholarship that is really basically looking at, it's rediscovering, it's recovering a kind of marginalized Buddhist kind of lineage. So, one great kind of project that's happening is by a guy called Dr. Nicholas Witowski, and he's looking at early Buddhist monasticism, and he's kind of showing that there were kind of lower caste kind of Buddhist monastics who, had a kind of had a radically different vision than the Brahmin Buddhist monastics. And, they've been kind of erased out of the canon. And then I've got another colleague called Dr. Stephanie Borkwell, and she's really recovering a kind of lineage in medieval Chinese Buddhism, that is also, engaged in, a kind of radical kind of social practice that she argues is a kind of precursor to like modern progressive Buddhism. So essentially, I think where I'm at now is, just kind of being more open-minded. And, rather than, just thinking of, canonical Buddhism is political, but is just politically conservative. I'm now kind of, feeling that, from its beginnings, Buddhism has always been political and has always had, different political orientations that we, might map onto the more progressive, but also the more conservative.
Right.
And, these are tensions that have gone, like just as we're seeing, this play out now in the American context with the backlash to racial justice, like in a way you can think of it as these kind of threads of the tradition that are being worked out in different ways in different cultural spaces.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, did I kind of stay on point?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, one big one that I would say is more progressive, after reading Isabel Wilkerson's great book, Caste, this year, that the Buddha did create this, at least the monastic community that basically disbanded the caste system. I mean, he still very much interacted with the power hierarchies outside of his monastic community, but that feels like a radically progressive step, but maybe it wasn't a complete
I think, and it's quite interesting with caste because like caste, you're right. I mean, caste is a great example again to show, the kind of complexity and the kind of two threads, because on the one hand, like, definitely we have this kind of, lineage of the Buddha, rejecting caste and, having this like real, radical act. And then, later on, of course, with Ambedkar, you see, that kind of Ambedkar, really, kind of pick up on that and, and have oversee this mass conversion of Dalits to Buddhism as this kind of socially radical, engaged religion. Right. But at the same time, we know historically that caste has actually always played a role in Buddhism in a discriminatory way. So there's a scholar called Jeffrey Samuels who looks at monastic orders in Sri Lanka, and he shows how, some monastic orders will only accept, people from certain castes. So again, you've got, and there's also a couple of places in the Pali Canon where the Buddha seems to uphold caste distinction, as well as places where he clearly challenges it. So you've just got so much going on in the Buddhist, not just in the Buddhist scriptures, but also what was actually happening in reality on the ground, because, the scriptures are, they're not necessarily, it's not a screenshot of what was like exactly happening on the ground, Yeah. So I think just in terms of like politics and like radical action and Buddhism, essentially, I would just say as a scholar, and I'm also learning myself from my colleagues, I would just kind of like think there is a lineage, I think, in Buddhism that supports radical social action, but there's also lineages which lend themselves to, conservatism and nationalism and forms of like ethnocentric Buddhism, not just, Western ethnocentric Buddhism, but what we're seeing now with the nationalist movements in Southeast Asia, that would be very, from a progressive sensibility, are very problematic. And I actually think they are legitimately Buddhist. So my take is, it's all Buddhist, so to me, it's not like what is like the true Buddhist political stance. I don't really think like that as a scholar. Right. To me, it's more like what causes the most violence, Right.
So maybe that's, there's so much I want to ask you, and I know we're coming towards our time, and so many other themes I wanted to ask you about QAnon, and have a deeper conversation. Although I think we've touched on it in sort of like some of these modern right-wing movements, among people calling themselves Buddhists. But I wonder is the solution not to say this is doing the real Buddhism, that's not doing the real Buddhism, but to just say, like, to know the different complex movements within the tradition, which feels humble and kind of, knowing your history to a certain degree, or not knowing your history, but knowing what you don't know. And then just saying, like, this is actually what feels more awakened or more compassionate or less violent. Like, does that save some of the problems of like colonizing Buddhism when we say, I'm not going to say, for example, that racial justice, or politics, or, even like having a more psychological, approach to Buddhism, which I would say I have a slightly more psychological than spiritual or religious approach. So if I don't try to couch it in terms of like, is this the real, is this not the real, but sort of say, this is what feels the most important to bring out, or the most important to express. Does that save it from the kind of modernist colonial impulse, or is there still a danger there?
No, I would say, first of all, I want to like shout like in caps, yes. I would definitely encourage everyone to drop, this notion of the real Buddhism, because I think that, essentially, when you erect something like the real, with a capital R, you're going to basically be doing violence to other forms of practice that fall outside of, of what you consider the real. And also, it just, it doesn't make sense as as an historian of religion, to think in terms of a real religion, because, religion is multiple. So I think there's, always kind of having the sense of the pluralism of Buddhism. As a practitioner, and, also, of course, as you say, the real, or the authentic in modern Buddhism has functioned as such a source of violence against, Asian Buddhists and Asian American Buddhists, because they've been seen as, inauthentic and not doing the real Buddhism. So that really avoids that violence. I think that as a Buddhist practitioner, I think it really depends, on the type of practitioner you are. Some religious practitioners are, much more comfortable with pluralism, than others. There are some Buddhists themselves who are like super sectarian, who say, just putting modernity aside, if you look at, classical Buddhism, there's an immense amount of, sectarian fighting and violence. Like, no, we've got the real Dharma. No, so, the question of the real Dharma, it's a sectarian question as well as a kind of a question of like grappling with the legacies of modern Buddhism. But I would say definitely like, a cultural awareness and kind of humility, I think are, two really important qualities that I would encourage, like your audience, to kind of cultivate in the, as Buddhists or, Buddhist identified people. And, you find like you will work with, all Buddhisms are also selective, right? So you're going to be drawn to certain doctrines or certain practices, over others, And so I would just claim that and, not worry about, proving that as more authentic than other Buddhists.
Well, that feels like a good place to stop our discussion, but I've definitely learned a lot today, Anne. So for those of you who forgot, I'm here with Professor Anne Gleig from her book. We're talking about American Dharma, Buddhism Beyond Modernity, and also just give a shout out to your Twitter handle, because I think it's great to follow, and you have a lot of threads about all these intersectional issues that are really helpful. So it's at AGLEIG on Twitter, and Donald Trump is no longer on Twitter, so that means we can be. Yeah, thank you so much for being on the Road Home podcast. It's really been like a wonderful office hours with you.
Oh, great. Well, thanks, Ethan. And I'm sorry if I rambled. As an academic, we do kind of ramble a bit. But I will say that I think, everything is like quite clearly explained in my book. So I encourage people to buy my book. Sorry to kind of self-promote there, but
that's what podcasts are for. So
Thank you.
American Dharma, Buddhism Beyond Modernity. So thank you all so much for listening, and for the Road Home podcast. This is Ethan Nichtern, and we'll see you next time.